What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Plant the Spear Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse, and thanks for tuning in. How about it, Nole Nation? What a weekend to be a Florida State fan. What a fun time. Man, you could not have asked for a better start to the season than Sunday night, absolutely smacking around LSU in just a huge statement win for Florida State. You also saw your rival Florida lose, and then Clemson got blown out by Doak. There's a lot to talk about in this episode, and I can't wait to get into it with you guys. I know it's been a few days, but I still want to try and bring the energy, go through this game, look at some things. I also want to do, in this episode, we're going to look at the LSU game, talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to do a little bit of like a resetting the board. Now that everybody's played, now that everybody's had a game, now a lot of these games it's hard to judge anything off of because they didn't really play anybody. But I do feel like we've seen some things. Most namely, we saw Florida State. We can kind of judge a few things now. So we're going to talk about that. And then we'll tag on a little Southern Miss preview at the end here. Again, guys, this is a game that Florida State should win going away. But it's only been one game. We haven't earned the right to sleepwalk through any games or anything like that. But this is a fun episode. We got a lot to talk about. So I'm excited to be with you guys. And just, again, we have not had this feeling in a long time. Florida State completely dominates the reigning SEC West champion. You're currently sitting at number 4 in the AP poll, number 5 in the coaches poll. You got a night game coming into Doak where you got a crowd that's already sold out the student section. They just announced that Virginia Tech is sold out. There's so much positive momentum and energy around this football team, and I'm just really glad to be a part of it and talking to you guys about it. I apologize to the podcast only listeners who I did not get a post-game instant reaction out. We were live on social media on YouTube for almost 3 hours that night, just talking back and forth, reading comments, having a great time. It's still on YouTube if you want to go check it out, but it was really fun. Now, before we get into this, I do want to tell you about something that you're not going to want to miss out on, and what better time to tell you about it than with the events that happened Monday night with Duke upsetting Clemson. So our partners over at Alumni Hall, they're currently running the Seminole Sweepstakes and giving away a package that you can win 4 tickets to the Duke game, hospitality passes, and a $200 gift card to Alumni Hall to stock up on your favorite FSU gear. So head over to alumnihall.com, navigate to the Florida State page, make sure you enter that because you don't want to miss this opportunity. I'll link it for you guys to make it nice and easy. And while you're there, go ahead and stock up on some Nole gear. Get 20% off with our code SPEAR online or in-store. I'm going to be there Friday. I got to stock up. It's a new season. You got to get some new gear. I can't wait to stop by and get my hands on some new stuff. Hopefully they let me use my own discount code. But that 20% off is only running until Saturday. Then it drops to 10%. So don't miss out on that and take advantage of that code. And go enter because that's a pretty sweet game day package that you're going to want to get a chance on winning. So getting into this thing, Florida State, I picked them to win before the game. I picked 34-27. I did say on the last episode, if you guys remember, that if I had to choose between Florida State winning by double digits or losing, I'm still taking Florida State because I just thought they were the better team. I think the funny thing was a lot of the national media, they thought Florida State was going to be good. They thought Florida State could be better. They had some pieces this year, but a lot of them still picked LSU. And, they had to eat some crow afterwards. So I think it was just really a statement game for Florida State to come out and let the college football world know, put them on notice that Florida State is here to play and they're ready to compete again on a national level. And that was really fun to see. Even picking them to win, I didn't really expect 45-24. And we know there was a garbage time touchdown. So really, if we're being honest, it was up 45-17. Should have been the final score there. They scored against some backups late in the game. So Florida State just had a dominant victory, and it was so much fun to watch them come out and just make a statement, especially after being nervous in the first half because things didn't get off to a great start. It was a little rocky in the beginning, but the version of Florida State that we saw in the second half of that game can compete with anybody in the country, and I'm confident in that. But, it's still only one game. It's a very small sample set, so they're going to have to go out and prove it again. But when you look at the interesting thing about this game, the fun thing about this game, is sometimes those big early season matchups make you nervous because you can win and then you can also certainly get beat. Half the country started out with FCS teams. You see a team like Oregon go out and win by 70-plus points, but they didn't play anybody. So what did you really learn from that game other than, maybe going through the motions against a team that's not even as good as what you see in practice? Whereas Florida State, you took a risk with playing a better team, but now you know what you got. You know what you got in this team. And the interesting thing about beating LSU like this and seeing some of the other games play out, LSU is probably, if not the best, one of the best teams on your schedule. I still think, even regarding the events that happened with Clemson and Duke, I still think Clemson's a good team. They still have a 70% blue chip ratio. But at the same time, they played really bad. And a lot of the things that, I wrote, I believe it was over 3,000 word preview for Clemson this season because it was such a big game and matchup and things. But we questioned a lot of the cracks in the foundation, the coordinator changes, the quarterback situation, the lack of really game changers at the skill positions, and all that stuff is starting to show up. And so I do think by beating LSU, it makes you feel so much better about the rest of your schedule because while Clemson's a good team and you have some other good teams out there like Pitt, LSU is not a bad team. Now, I can't talk out of both sides of my mouth because I did say before the game I thought they were a little overhyped. Do I think they belong in the top 5? No, I don't think they did. But do I think seeing how the games played out this weekend that they belong top 15? For sure, definitely. You could argue that they were even a top 10 team. And I also think once they get Mason Smith back, once they get Logan Diggs back, and once they work out some things, because they made a lot of mistakes too. They had another muffed punt. Brian Kelly apparently hates points. He didn't kick any field goals. He left a lot of points out there. And then you also have a lot of drop passes and mistakes that they made too. Once they clean that up, they're going to be a good team. It's not like you just beat an LSU team where, say for instance, the Colorado TCU situation. I saw where some people said that TCU only had 3 returning starters from last year's national championship team. That's not the case at LSU. We knew they were going to be a good team. You don't expect them to go out and win 7 games or 6 games. They're probably going to be a 9 to 10 win team who contends for the SEC West title again this year. I don't think they're going to win it, but they're a good team. And so beating them in the fashion that you did makes you feel a lot better about the rest of your schedule. I also think with what happened with Clemson, this game really just became 10 times more important. This win became 10 times bigger because when you look at last year with LSU, they came out of the gate, they lost to Florida State, they got blown out by Tennessee, but then they had that big redemption game against Alabama that allowed them to get back in the playoff picture. We said about Florida State this year, if you were to lose to LSU, but then you come back and beat Clemson, basically we said you want to go 2-0, you just can't go 0-2, you at least need to go 1-1. Now that you don't really have that big redemption game anymore with Clemson, and I'm not saying it's not a big game, and we're going to talk about it, but now you don't necessarily, it's not going to be a top 5 win like this was. So this one is a huge game for Florida State's resume going forward, and now you want LSU to do good the rest of the year because it's going to help strengthen what your schedule looks like. But if Florida State wins all their games, if they go 12-0 in the regular season, they're going to be where they want to be with respect to the playoffs. And I do expect Clemson to be ranked in that game because they fell all the way to 21st or 25th, depending on which poll you look at. They have 2 easy games coming up. They'll probably hold on to that ranking. So it will give you, if you're able to beat them, and going into Death Valley is hard. We can't overlook that. I don't expect Florida State to just go in there and walk the dog on them necessarily like you saw with LSU, because I do think they're going to kind of put their backs against the wall. I think they're going to be a little pissed off, and they got 2 games to work some kinks out. But I still think Florida State is the better team in that game. And now is a good time to revisit some things when you look at the totality of what happened this weekend. So, I do think the LSU game was really big for FSU, not only as a statement-wise, but just kind of a proving to yourself that you really can beat every team on the schedule. Florida State realistically can go 12-0. And, we'll talk about more about this when we get to the resetting the board part of the show. But, I want to go back and revisit some things. I picked Florida State to go 11-1, so there's not a whole lot that really can change there. But you did see Florida State come out and be the team that we thought they could be in 2023. So first, we'll go through some of my thoughts on this LSU game. First, I will say that while it's not good for our health, because this game had me frustrated in the first half, this was a really fun series between two, good programs with really top-level athletes. It was physical. It was hard-hitting. It had explosive moments. It had dramatic moments. These two teams need to play more often, and the trash talk between the fan base was fun. It added to the excitement. I don't know about you guys, but Monday I spent most of my day pulling receipts on the LSU fans who came in and said they were just going to blow Florida State out. That was a pretty fun time, but this was a fun series, and I will say that my first biggest takeaway about this game is Florida State's size. These guys are massive. I mean, this isn't the same team that we've seen in the past years, and I really do think that one of the most underrated aspects of the success that this team is having, and we know about it, we appreciate it inside the Florida State community, is Coach Storms and what the strength and conditioning staff has done with this team. Not only do they look big, not only are they massive, but they are well built. It's not like they have a lot of large guys that are out of shape. They're in great shape. And then towards the end of the game, you saw LSU's defense was gassed. They were tanked. They had some quit in them, if we're being honest. I mean, they really kind of beat LSU to sleep. And then Florida State was out there still having fun, making plays and just having a good time. I didn't see any, from either side of the ball getting gassed by Florida State. And it speaks to that strength and conditioning. So really that was one of the biggest takeaways, is that you can line up on the field with the reigning SEC West champion and you look like you belong in that type of competition and that against that type of team with your size and your strength. And that also comes through in their style of play. I mean, this is a team that played really fast, physical, and aggressive, and they bullied LSU for a good part of that game. You saw the run where Jaheim Bell decleats a DB going into the end zone. Rodney Hill bodies a guy running down the sideline. The defense abused some guys. I mean, Tatum Bethune just absolutely massacred Jaden Daniels. This is twice now where he got tattooed in that game, and maybe he should think twice about running against this defense. But just the way they play, this is the kind of defense that we have missed for so long, that we were used to from back in the Mickey Andrews days, where guys fly around and they're headhunters, and that's really what this defense has now. That's how they play. And I do think that a lot of that comes from my next takeaway, is that Mike Norvell has an edge about him this year that we really, he's always been an intense guy. He's very genuine. He doesn't change. But, man, he looks like a guy who knows he's got something to prove this year, and he's got the team to do it, and he's got a list of names, and he's going on a revenge tour, because I'm sure everybody saw the TV cutaway that I did where Derek Brooks came up and bumped him, and Mike just looks like he is just out for blood. And that's really exciting because, I think a lot of that, like we said, it stems from him knowing that he has the team. If they play up to their potential, they can beat everybody on the schedule. Realistically, and we're going to talk about a lot more about this game, but if the game had been called fairly, and the refs were atrocious in this game, we'll touch on that in a second, but if they had played a clean half of football in the first half of that game, this game really could have got nasty. And 45-17 minus the garbage time score, that was pretty bad as it is. But you just see that killer instinct in Norvell this year, and I really do think that, if he can run it up on you, man, I think he's going to hang 50 on as many teams as he can. And I made a joke on social media about where Dabo was writing in the note on the sideline, and someone had said, caption this, and I had put on there, "Dear Mike Norvell, please don't hang 50 on us. Sincerely, Dabo." Just being funny. And a lot of people are like, don't overlook Clemson. They're not going to overlook Clemson. I think the best thing about this team is they have that work ethic, that nose to the grindstone type of work ethic. Of course, they celebrate a big win, and they earned it because of all the offseason work that they put in. They earned this win. They earned the right to celebrate. But they really didn't do a lot of it. It was more about, this was just game one. It didn't, we got a lot left to go, and we got to get back to work. I actually saw one of the players Instagram live the post-game speech by Norvell, and one of the things he said was, "I'm kind of pissed off that it wasn't worse." And that just tells you that you just beat the number 5 team, reigning SEC West champion, by 3 scores, 4 if you don't count the garbage time, and he was mad that it wasn't worse. And, the garbage time scores, they drive me crazy because it just, everybody saw the game and how it played out, but it always looks better to not give up those garbage time points. But they talked more in that speech about getting back to work. Make sure you get your treatments next week. You know we have a short week. We got to get back to work. And that's what's so impressive about this team is they know they're good. Mike Norvell knows they're good. We all were kind of like, we want them to go win a national championship. They should aim for an ACC championship, this, that, and the other. But they've said the whole time, we're out to win a championship because they know what they have. And we saw that on display tonight. Now, it didn't start that way, but it's the first game of the season, and there was a lot of sloppy games around the country being game one. Everybody has to kind of get back in sync, which is another reason why I really didn't hammer on Clemson too much until the end of the game because, hey, we made a lot of mistakes too. Who am I to go talk about them until we watch the full body work, give them a chance to fix the mistakes, and they didn't, and it cost them dearly. Now, the next thing I want to touch on in this game is the officiating because, man, it was terrible. This was one of the worst first halves of officiating I've ever seen, and that's saying a lot for a team that plays, that has to deal with ACC refs on the regular. So it was a Big 12 crew. It was terrible. And, I mean, you're talking about you come up and talk to Tatum Bethune after he rocks Jaden Daniels in a tackle football game. You're mad because he hit the quarterback too hard. Like, what are we doing here? They missed a crucial delay a game in the red zone. They missed a late hit on Jordan Travis that they had been calling on LSU. Was it an egregiously bad hit? No, but it's the same thing you call on Florida State when they do it. You allow them to throw down Florida State players, but then call it on FSU. So, it just really, it's crazy to think that they had 0 penalties in the entire first half when I posted a picture on social media of Braden Fisk getting hugged by 2 guys right in front of a referee and it didn't get called. And then Florida State gets 6 penalties. Now, the head referee, they said before the game that his brother was a member of the Louisiana National Guard and did the flyover for the game, but I'm sure that probably had nothing to do with it. I mean, what kind of conflict of interest? How do we allow this to happen? But it's neither here nor there, but because you won the game. Now, if Florida State had lost, we'd probably be making a lot bigger deal about it. But I think the impressive thing is, yes, Florida State was dominant in the second half. They won the game 31-7 in the second half. Technically, if you don't count that garbage time touchdown, and I know it does count, I understand that, but you beat LSU 31-0 in a half of football. That is incredibly dominant against a team like LSU. But almost more impressive is when you look at the first half, how bad Florida State played. And LSU made mistakes too. I don't want to take that away from them. But Florida State made a lot of mistakes. They had a lot of miscues. We saw uncharacteristic things from Jordan Travis that we hadn't seen and we didn't expect from him. There was a lot of penalties that were Florida State's fault. The late hit on the sideline by Verse. You got to know better than that. Throwing the guy down, was it egregious? No, but you got to know better than that. So they can clean those things up. But the fact that you played bad in the first half, you also were getting screwed by the refs repeatedly, and you were still within 3 points of LSU, of the number 5 team in the country, playing bad. To me, that speaks to how good this team is, that you don't really even have to bring your A game to still compete with some of the best teams on your schedule. Now, you need to because, again, like we talked about, Florida State hasn't really earned the right to sleepwalk through any games. But this is a different team, guys. This is a lot different. And, one of the big talks of the weekend was Colorado and how they beat TCU. And that was a huge win for them. I'm not here to talk about Deion, and I'm not here to, make a hill of beans out of that. But the thing is, when people talk about Deion took, a 1-11 Colorado team to beat TCU, it's not really the case. It's not a 1-11 team. He has 80 transfers. That's not a 1-11 team. That's a brand new team. And I think when you look at Florida State, talking about resetting the board in a little bit, when we did our preseason prediction, it was okay, well, I thought they were going to be 11-1, but if you pick them to beat LSU, and you pick them to beat Clemson, outside of a hiccup game, you're picking them to go undefeated, and that felt like a stretch for a team that was 5-7 just a couple years ago, and a team that we know lost to Jacksonville State. This is not the same team. The amount of physical development, the maturity, the amount of playmakers they have, this is not even remotely the same team, which is why we laughed so hard when everybody from LSU said, well, this is the same team, so what do we have to be worried about? And so, Again, like I said, if you are able to hang with LSU playing bad football, and then blow them out, absolutely dominate them whenever you are playing your best, it just really makes you excited for the rest of the season. And Florida State should win the rest of their games along the way. Now, of course, I do expect Clemson to rebound a little bit, and going to play at Death Valley is tough, and we'll talk about that in just a few. So, and I also have to say that Brian Kelly apparently hates points. He didn't really kick any field goals down in the red zone when he probably should have. They went for it on fourth down a lot. But at the same time, you frustrated Brian Kelly. I mean, it's funny to watch because he complained about the refs, even though he was getting all the calls. He complained about the crowd. He complained. He threw his players under the bus again, like he always does, like he did at Notre Dame that year, where he said a comment that he probably shouldn't have said. But it was fun to watch. It was a fun game by Florida State to be on the giving end of the beat down. That is always fun. So talking about this offense a little bit, they started slow in the first half, but realistically, I mean, it wasn't super terrible. You had over 200 yards in the first half, and you did put up 14 points. But, this is now the 7th consecutive game that Florida State has scored over 35 points. And this is why you hired Mike Norvell. This is what you wanted, the offense that was built for playmakers. But he had never really had the playmakers to run the offense that we knew he could achieve. But now you have an embarrassment of riches at the skill positions, and you're seeing that come to fruition. You're seeing him be able to run an offense that's built for playmakers now that you have playmakers. And so this offense, again, you look at next week and the week after against Southern Miss and Boston College, you're probably going to score close to 50 in those two games, definitely over 35. I don't see that changing in the next few weeks. And so this offense is just really becoming a juggernaut. Now, like I said, this is only one game, so I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. But when you look at the way LSU is compared to your schedule, like this is one of the best defensive lines you're going to face the entire season. Clemson's probably got a better defensive line. These are some of the best linebackers you're going to face the rest of the season. Their secondary, I don't think their secondary is trash. I just think this is such a dominant wide receiver core. And I don't think their secondary is very good, and we said that was going to be a mismatch in this game. So it might not be the best pass defense you face, but it's certainly not the worst. And you had a lot of success. You put up 494 yards, 511 scrimmage yards, which takes away negative plays. You had a 52% success rate, 7.74 yards per play. They averaged 6.96 in all of 2022. The offense was very efficient. They had an explosive play rate of 15%. And for comparison's sake, Clemson's against Duke was 1%, which is one of the things we're going to talk about later. They were 9 of 14 on third down. And while, like we talked about with Jordan, while he had some plays that were uncharacteristic in the first half, the way he came out in the second half was the kind of guy that we wanted to see. That's what we were hoping Jordan Travis would do. He had complete control of the offense. He looked comfortable. He didn't get rattled. And you really could tell this team has a veteran presence because even though they were playing bad, they were down at halftime, they didn't get upset. They didn't, argue or point fingers. They just came together and did what they had to do to fix the issues. So looking at Jordan, he had 380 total yards, 5 total touchdowns, 74.2% completion rate, which jumps to 86.7% adjusted completion rate once you factor out all the drops and throwaways. And we know drop passes were a problem. And it wasn't just Johnny Wilson. We saw Johnny drop 2 big passes, which I think the problem with Johnny Wilson is like he still had a really quiet 100-yard game. He caught 7 passes on 9 targets. He only had 2 incompletions. They just looked bad because they happened at a really bad time when you needed that pass. So, he still has some drop issues to clean up. We also saw Jaheim Bell have a big drop there. But there's just so many weapons on this offense that is you can spread the ball around. And the fun thing about that is, say you do have a guy who's having an off day. Say you do have Johnny Wilson is just having a tough day with drops. Now you have someone else to go to. Last year you had Pokey Wilson, who you could use in certain ways, but now you have Keon Coleman that you can go to. Now you have Jaheim Bell. A lot of the best players on this offense that are still weapons, we didn't even see. Like Destin Hill came in early. He was out the rest of the game. I don't think it was an injury thing. Maybe they just didn't see what they wanted from him. I'm pretty sure he's still available. There was no injury concern there. Winston Wright only had one catch, but it was nice to see him get back in the game and actually make a catch in a game situation. That's a guy who's still coming along. We didn't see Portier didn't play at all. Darren Williamson didn't play at all. So, again, these are guys, because Holmes didn't play at all. So now, you still have more weapons on the bench that are probably good enough to beat half the teams on your schedule that didn't even play. And if you can get them in game situations, say like a Southern Miss, where you let your guys come out, your top guys, you get in sync, you work out some of the mistakes, and then you get them rest, and you let these other guys come in and play. Now you're keeping those high-end guys fresh, and you're building that competitive depth behind them. So looking farther, a little bit more at Jordan, he had 11.0 yards per attempt. Last year he had 9.1, which was one of the best in college football. Now, that 11 yards per attempt was 8th among Power 5 quarterbacks with a similar sample size, but only one other quarterback played against a Power 5 defense, and that was Penn State's quarterback who played against West Virginia, and I would easily argue that LSU has a better defense than West Virginia. And I do really think, when you look at what Florida State's offense was able to do in this game, really what Florida State as a team was able to do in this game, you had one of the most statistically impressive games of the weekend against the toughest team. I don't think anybody else even played that was ranked. I think this was the only ranked game of the weekend. So you had a very successful weekend against one of the best teams, that anybody faced. Now, when you talk about this offense, of course, you have to lead the conversation. Of course, we already talked about Jordan Travis and how efficient he was. And, he struggled early, but he became the guy that we expected. And he's got to be excited about the guy we're about to talk about. Keon Coleman is an absolute game changer, and this is what we wanted to see. He showed you he was exactly who we had hoped and dreamed he would be in this offense. Comes in, takes over his very first game at Florida State, 122 yards, 3 touchdowns. But what really stood out to me about Keon is he really is a do-it-all guy. He caught a jump ball touchdown in the end zone. He had 100% contested catch rate, so he can go up and get it. He can win 50-50 balls. He caught one downfield and made defenders miss in space. 44% of those 122 yards came after the catch, so he's a guy who can catch it and work in space. He's just really, and he has an incredible combination of size and just ability, and he can kind of work the field in multiple ways. This is a guy who we talked about in the preseason. How many games do you feel better about Florida State winning with Keon Coleman? And truthfully, you could argue it was happened in game 1, because had he not had such a big game, does Florida State pull away like they did? We don't know, but he took over the very first game that he played and had an 81.8% reception rate, caught almost everything that was thrown his way, and possibly the funnest moment of the game, especially referring to Keon Coleman, was when he called a shot. He Babe Ruthed a touchdown. There was the video where he was waving over the sideline because he knew he had a matchup that he could take advantage of, and he's like, yo, hey, throw it to me. I got it. I got 6. Literally the very next play, he goes up for a touchdown over the DB that he called out. So to me, that's impressive that not only do you have a guy that knows he has a mismatch, but he can communicate that and then capitalize on it as well. This is just going to be someone that's going to be really hard to stop for every defense this season, especially when, like we talked about, Johnny Wilson had a 100-yard game, caught 7 of 9 passes, still had a 77.8% reception rate, and we really aren't even talking about Johnny Wilson after this game. So now, like we talked about before, this is a pick your poison situation. Who do you try and shade extra coverage to? Because we still can't forget that Johnny Wilson is a dominant receiver. He's going to drop some passes. We know that's who he is. Hopefully, we can continue to clean that up. But, and maybe now Jordan looks Keon's way in pressure situations because he has a little bit better hands. But at the same time, if you are so mystified by stopping as a defensive coordinator Keon Coleman, well, you still got Johnny Wilson to deal with, which is an unnatural mismatch with his size and speed. You still have Jaheim Bell, who we wanted him to be in this game. And so to me, it was so fun to watch this offense. Like, they're going to be dangerous this year, and I'm extremely excited. Coming into this game, we knew the offense, we expected it to do well. The early struggles were a little bit concerning, but then they picked it up. What we really wanted to see in this game was the defense, and could they hold up to what the standard that the offense was going to set. And the good thing about this game was you kind of got a little bit of everything. You saw the defense keep Florida State in the game whenever the offense was struggling. They had multiple huge stops, multiple goal line stands, and they came up big when the offense was struggling. So they played really complementary football, and that lets you know that even with an elite level offense, if sometimes they're having an off day, you have a defense that's good enough to keep you in the game. And, while you may end up seeing a team like UNC in the ACC championship, who has a really top-level offense, better than anything you're probably going to see on the schedule, looking out over the schedule, there's not a whole lot of offenses that are better than what LSU has. And really, like Clemson was probably the one you might have looked at, but that narrative has flipped a little bit. And we're going to talk about Clemson later, but again, you also look, like we mentioned, you look at Jaheim Bell. Man, that dude is huge. Like, he is thick. And he's just hard to tackle. You saw him bullying people. Like I said, he decleated somebody, going in for that touchdown that he had late in the game. But I think the cool thing that we saw from Jaheim Bell in this game was the unselfishness that he had and the versatility that was on display that we expected earlier, before the season started. He lined up out wide. He lined up in the slot. He lined up at tight end. He lined up at running back in a two-back set and was one heck of a lead blocker with that size. Believe he's around 6'3", 230. And, that's like a fullback and a tailback all in one when you look at his size and skill set and what he was able to do in that game. So the fact that he transferred here because he didn't really like the way he was being used at South Carolina, but also willing to be a lead blocker at the running back position when he comes in as a tight end, it speaks to this team and how they treat each other for the good of the team. You know what I mean? There's not a whole lot of I in this one. There's a lot more, I just want to do what's best for my team, and that's something that we saw from Jaheim Bell, but he's still an incredible athlete. He had a passing touchdown, a rushing touchdown. So, again, it just speaks to the weapons that they have in this offense. Now, when you talk about another aspect of this receiver group and how big they are, the downfield blocking showed too. Hakeem Williams had a great downfield block. You saw on Toa Philly's nice long play. Some of the other receivers just pushing guys around. Like, this is another aspect, is the size. You're blocking some corners that are probably going to be around the 5'10", maybe, a big corner 6'2", and you got guys that are 6'4", 6'7" out there that are just going to be pushing guys around. So that also helps. The one maybe knock on the offense in the first game was it took a little bit to get the running game going. I thought the run push by the offense wasn't that great in the first half, but they did clean it up. They didn't abandon the run. They stuck with the run. Trey took a little bit to get going, but if you remember last year, Trey did have a little bit of a hard time getting going in some games, particularly the LSU game. That was a game where Trayshawn Ward led in rushing, and sometimes Trey is a really, really hard runner, but he's not the most patient. He's not the most shifty guy. He just hits the hole. He's north and south, and a lot of times that works great. But that was the one thing that we thought we were going to miss from Trayshawn Ward, is the ability for him to make you miss in a phone booth. You saw Rodney Hill come in and have some good plays. You also saw Toa Philly, who's the complete opposite style runner as Trey Benson, where he is that patient guy. He is kind of gadgety back. And so when you combine the skill sets that everybody has, if one guy's struggling, you're able to get another guy going. And I do think Trey had some good runs in this game, and I think he's going to be perfectly fine. I'm not disappointed, at all. I think LSU's like we said, their strength is their front seven on that defense. They have a good defensive line. They have good linebackers. Florida State struggled to block Wingo a few times. But, outside of Clemson, like we said, this is probably the best defensive line you're going to face. And they did end up rushing for 135 yards. They did end up, getting the backs going in the second half. And I do think this next game, which we'll talk about later against Southern Miss, you're going to have an opportunity to really get your backs going here, and you may get to see some more of the depth chart there. Because like I said, we didn't see Keziah Holmes in this game. You could even see C.J. Campbell in this next coming up game as well. So overall, I do think the offensive line did well, considering the level of competition, and that it was game one with some new starters that they have to get in sync. I think pass blocking was good in the game. You didn't give up any sacks. And I know a lot of that helps that Jordan has the dual threat ability. And I will say, like, Jordan's running has changed. He doesn't just tuck it and run down the field anymore. Even though he can, he has the ability to take off and really hurt defenses. But now he seems to be a more efficient runner. He runs to open up the pass. He still looks downfield when he scrambles. And he's really good at avoiding pressure. Jaden Daniels is more of a, there's pressure in my face, I got to go. Jordan is more of a guy that's just evading a sack to look for something down the field. So overall, I think the offense, just like we talk about with Clemson, they got a couple of games to get things worked out. I think Florida State has the same situation with Boston College having a disappointing first game, and then Southern Miss, you're just going to outman them in that game. So you have 2 games to kind of get some things sorted out before you have that important game at Clemson. Talking a little bit more about the defense, you did allow 460 total yards, but I think when you kind of read between the lines here, 70 of that was on the first 2 plays. Now, I know those first 2 plays happened, and, they lost the running back on one of the plays. That can happen at any game. 10th game of the season, that can happen. But you do have to remember, it was week 1. It was game 1. It was the first 2 plays of the game. Once the defense settled in, you didn't see a whole lot of that anymore. And, not only that was 70 of their yards, but you also had the 75-yard garbage time touchdown. So if you were to, let's just say, and it's hard to just remove things that happened in the game, but if you remove 3 plays, that puts them down at 315 yards, and that's very good against this type of offense. Now, you did give up 293 yards in the first half, only 167 in the second half, 92 without the garbage time touchdown. But we saw, once they settled in, the defense had a really good game. Huge goal line stands. You had a lot of huge plays by multiple different players. Like DJ Lundy had a breakout game. He had a huge sack down on the goal line. He had a really good game. He's a super athletic linebacker that you feel really good about this season, because it was one of them where we thought he had the potential to be that really good third rotating linebacker. But, if he has to start, this is a guy you feel good about. The game he had against LSU. You also had the defensive line. We have to talk about them for a minute. Of course, to maybe round out linebackers. Tatum Bethune, I thought he had a good game. He had that great hit on Jaden Daniels, which was really fun. Again, that's 2 years in a row that he's been rocked running against his defense. So he might want to think twice about that if they ever play again. But the defensive line really stood out for me for Florida State. We knew it was going to be a strength this year, even down Darrell Jackson. But when you look at it, man, these guys are huge. It looks like a bunch of refrigerators running around a defensive tackle, because they are so big and so massive. And despite being held all night long, which they got away with, they still impacted the game greatly. And I liked what you saw from Jared Verse. I like what you saw from Patrick Payton. Braden Fisk was an absolute animal out there, which I did like to see. He's a grown man. That's a really big dude. He lined up inside. He lined up outside. And, a lot of times maybe the stat sheet doesn't pop because you're eating a lot of double teams. And that was happened to Fisk a lot that night. You really didn't even see Fabo play much in this game. He didn't play many snaps, but you also saw Joshua Farmer step up in his place. And man, Joshua Farmer looks different this year. He is a massive dude as well. He really physically matured over the offseason, and he had a great game. Gilbert Edmond had a big TFL. Dennis Briggs had a big play. So it's not like you just had Jared Verse out there carrying everybody else. Patrick Payton looked good. You have your starting 4 and then about another 3 or 4 guys that you feel really good about that made plays against one of the better offensive lines that you're going to face. Now, I do understand it is fair to say that I'd questioned their offensive line and how good it was going to be. I thought they were a little overhyped, but you really came out and had a successful day against one of the better units that you're going to face this season. So I think the defense really did have a great game. They got 15 pressures, 4 sacks on Jaden Daniels. When they got into the backfield, they did a good job of getting him on the ground. 26.7% pressure to sack ratio percentage. They held them to under 5 yards per rush. The backs in that game did basically nothing. I think they had less than 20 yards combined at the running backs. Jaden Daniels really was their offense. And I do think, the other thing too, when you look at if you had to knock the defense, the secondary could have played a little better. Now, we did see them get an interception, which was nice because that was something that we talked about we wanted to see from them this year was more interceptions. You did allow 347 yards passing against Jaden Daniels, which isn't that great. He only had 2 games over 300 yards last year against 2 bad passing defenses. But again, like we said with the total yardage, 90 of it came off 2 plays in the first half. And then you also had the 75-yard touchdown, garbage time touchdown there as well. So I don't think it was really a bad game by the secondary. I just think a lot of it, they have a few things they can clean up, of course. There's some miscommunications, and LSU has some decent receivers. We didn't, Malik Neighbors is a good receiver. I thought Kyron Lacey, he's got a lot of potential, but he dropped a lot of passes as well. But I will say that, I think the secondary is going to be fine because a lot of it, too, when you look at the way they played, I think the defense had a big game plan heavily leaning towards stopping Jaden Daniels. That's why you saw at one point where they tried Fentrell Cypress twice and they didn't get anywhere with it. They kept saying, they even commented on the broadcast, they're not giving them any safety help and they got a matchup that they think they want. And a lot of that was you left your corners on an island because you wanted to make Jaden Daniels beat you with his arm. And anytime you do that, there's going to be some mishaps here and there. But I think it was a good game plan by Adam Fuller because that's what we said in the pregame. That was the key to the game, was making Jaden Daniels throw to beat you with a receiving core that's not very deep. And they weren't able to do it. Mason Taylor really didn't do much outside of one catch early in the game that was, I think, about 15 yards. And actually, I had a note here that after looking at the second half, Florida State only allowed 1 pass over 15 yards in the second half if you take away the garbage time touchdown. Against their starting defense, they only gave up 1 pass over 15 yards the entire second half. So they really cleaned things up, and I think they're going to be fine there. You had to, again, it's game 1. And so I do think the defense had a great day against one of the better offenses that you're going to face. Special teams had a good day. Shout out Ryan Fitzgerald. Made his field goal when he came in. It wasn't really a long one or a crazy angle, but it was enough to get him some confidence to make a field goal in a big game. That was good to see. Florida State's kick coverage is really impressive, and I'm not really sure why they didn't fair catch more of the kicks after about the third time they started inside their 20, but Florida State was all over them. And their punt coverage was great. I mean, when they muffed that punt, there was 4 or 5 Florida State guys standing around there that just kind of threw him out of the way and took the ball. They were just, and I think that was something where with a team like this, you just don't want your special teams to be a hindrance. And I think it was a very good night for the special teams. So that's something to go, to be happy about going forward, because you really can't point to a whole lot of weaknesses on this team unless you point it at the finger back at yourself. It's the mistakes. It's the penalties. Now, of course, you're not going to get screwed by the refs in every game like you did with this one. But while it was a tale of two halves, like we talked about, that first half you were able to hang with LSU playing bad football. Not terrible, but it wasn't the best brand of football. And then you absolutely wiped the field with them in the second half, 31-7. If you don't count the garbage time touchdown, it's 31-0. And to me, the team that we saw in the second half for FSU, knowing that they can still get better by cleaning up some of these things and getting more game experience, man, it's hard not to think this team's going to go 12-0. Like I said, I predicted them to go 11-1 to begin with, so that's not really a big jump. But seeing what you saw from some of the other teams around the country, you got to feel really good about Florida State being able to go and compete for the playoffs and win the ACC. I do think that one thing that's interesting, talking about Florida State and Clemson, we talked a lot this offseason about the rematch in the ACC championship with Clemson, but how the Death Valley game was still important because that rematch wasn't guaranteed. Well, that rematch might not be guaranteed for Clemson either. They didn't expect to lose to Duke, and they still have to play Florida State. They still have to play USC. They still have to go to NC State. They still have Notre Dame, which is an ACC, but you get what I'm saying. Like, they could lose 3 to 4 games this in a regular season. They could miss out on the ACC championship, and you may end up finding yourself playing like a UNC or maybe even a Duke. Who knows? I do think this was really big for recruiting, especially when you see how the way Clemson looked. Like, you saw Cade Klubnik walks by and just leaves Dabo hanging on the sideline with like a high five, and you saw some frustrations from that team. And yet you have Florida State showing out with a bunch of big-name recruits in the stands. You got a 5-star wide receiver watching Keon Coleman have a gigantic day. That stuff's going to pay off in recruiting, and Florida State's 24 class, last I checked, was still ranked above Clemson. So, this win does more than just look good on the field. This is going to be huge for recruiting as well because, man, I mean, there was a lot of big names in attendance. You were the only game on Sunday night, so everybody was watching, and I know everybody saw the game that Florida State had, and you want to be a part of that. You want to be out there making those plays, and Florida State right now, when you look across the country at the teams that played, and like we talked about, not many people really played anybody tough. Florida State looks like one of the best teams in the country. They really do. Like, the amount of playmakers they have, the amount of NFL draft picks that look like they're on this roster. We only saw them to have one guy get taken last year. Now, granted, that was a lot because a lot of guys came back, but there's probably realistically 10 to 12 draft picks on this roster, and now you're starting to see Florida State has that talent level. They have that experience, and now you're starting to see they have great coaching. They just now have the talent to work with as well. So that's why I do think you have to reset the board a little bit. So we'll talk a little bit in this next segment about how some of the other teams did in week 1 and how that changes our view on Florida State as a whole. And I think we should start with the Clemson game because this is your biggest game on the rest of the schedule. Now, of course, every game is big, but talking about Clemson, to me, it wasn't so much about what Duke did. Now, Duke is a scrappy team, and they're good, and they get 100% credit for this win. That is a program builder when you talk about the amount of wins. Like, they'll hang their hat on this for a long time, but it's more about the way Clemson looked and what they allowed Duke to do that stood out to me. And I posted a long thread on social media with a lot of stats that you can check out and stuff of why I saw what was concerning to me about that Clemson game, because a lot of their fans jumped in the comments and would say, well, we outgained them in total yardage. We had more first downs than them. We're fine. It's okay. And the thing to me was, Florida State outgained their opponents in 2 of their 3 losses last year. They outgained Clemson by 90 yards and had 10 extra first downs in the game last year. Does that mean Florida State was a better team last year? No, it's more than just total yardage. And at the same time, when we're talking about different things like the pressure they allowed and the way that their defensive backs played against their receivers, like, you're talking about Clemson versus Duke. We're not talking about comparing you to what you did against Alabama. We're not talking about comparing them even against an NC State. You're talking about Duke, who I believe I saw a graphic afterwards where they have, I think, 2 4-star or better players on the entire roster, and Clemson has a 70% blue chip ratio. That game should have never been that close, even with mistakes. I think you're seeing a lot of the cracks in the foundation start to show through for Clemson. You're seeing the lack of skill players, game changers at the skill position, should I say, that is starting to show up. Now, they're still really good in the trenches, especially on the defensive side of the ball, but you're starting to see that it was a team that reminded me of the later end of the Jimbo era, where teams thought they had enough talent that they could go in playing a team like Duke and just roll the helmet out there and win the game, and they really didn't have to show up for the game. And Duke came out and punched them in the mouth. They set the physical tone for that game. Now, yes, Clemson did make a ton of mistakes. So did Duke. If it wasn't for a muffed punt, Clemson gets shut out. But Clemson made a lot of mistakes, and those can get cleaned up. But the funny thing is, a lot of people just assume mistakes will get cleaned up. I wanted to watch the whole game. I couldn't judge them off of the first half because, we made our own mistakes, and how can I judge them for that? Let me give them an opportunity, but they didn't clean them up. So who's to say that some of those same mistakes aren't going to rear their head in a big game like Florida State when maybe you're up against the ropes like you were in the Duke game? That you can't just assume they're going to get fixed. But when I looked at Clemson, the mistakes were a big part of it. I understand that. And they did move the ball in their own way. We're going to talk about that as well. But what really stood out to me was the offense just really did not look good at all. They struggled to push the ball down the field. 72.1% of their passes were under 10 yards, even though they were trailing for most of that game. They didn't have a single pass completion over 20 yards. They had a 0% contested catch rate out of 5 contested passes. They had a reception rate of only 67.5% with 4 drops. And while teams are certainly allowed to get better, and it's a new team from last year, Duke had the 105th ranked pass defense last year against a weak schedule. Clemson only had a 1% explosive play rate. And if we're being honest, Cade Klubnik really didn't look much better than he did in the Orange Bowl against Tennessee as a true freshman. And the thing that's interesting about that is, everybody blamed the offensive struggles last year on the coordinator and on DJU. Well, DJU had a 5-touchdown game at Oregon State this weekend, so that kind of busted that narrative. Now, I know Klubnik's still young, but that was one of the cases that I made in the preseason preview that I did on Clemson, and I wrote over 3,000 words on them because it was such a big, important game in preview. I questioned a lot of his success came against teams that had bad passing defenses. So was he going to be able to, with a little bit of experience in a new offense, succeed? Now, I don't know if it was just Klubnik's maybe not what we thought he could be, or if the offense just isn't maybe what he needs to succeed, and maybe that's what led to the frustrations that we saw on the sideline. But at the same time, they could not push the ball down the field. They have receivers who really can't go and win one-on-one battles against a team like Duke. That's a problem. When you look at the pressure, they allowed 42.6% of their dropbacks were pressured, even though Duke only blitzed 25.5% of the time. Now, think about when they're going to face a team with more talent on the defensive line, like Florida State. That makes your mouth water when you think about this defense being able to play against an offensive line that had Duke run through them. And that's supposed to be one of the best lines in the ACC. Now, again, teams can get better. They can get things cleaned up. They have Florida Atlantic coming up next and Charleston Southern coming up after that. So they have 2 games to get things right. But at the same time, that's going to be a big ramp up in competition whenever you see Florida State, even versus what you saw against Duke. So now, again, like we talked about, it was a huge talent disparity, and they should have never even been in that game, even with the mistakes. And that's what we talked about with Florida State. Even though you made a ton of mistakes, you still hung with LSU. So that's going to be a really interesting game. I mean, there's still some things there. Like Duke really struggled to block that defensive line. And Riley Leonard is an incredible athlete at quarterback. He didn't beat him with their arm. I mean, I think he only had 175 passing yards. He had a 50% completion rate. So it wasn't the throwing that won the game. It was a lot of the rushing that won that game. And, if you have a mobile quarterback or you can block them, and we have Jordan Travis and we feel good about our offensive line, then I think you can beat them. We know being in Death Valley is going to be hard. We know Clemson's going to kind of have their backs against the wall by everybody telling them they suck now. But they have some real problems that they have to fix. And I think it's more than just mistakes. And I'm not going to say that Florida State's going to go in there and roll Clemson, but you kind of are starting to get the 2013 vibes about that game. I don't want to get ahead of myself after one game. I don't want to sit here and act like Florida State's going to beat everybody by 50 points. We haven't won in Death Valley in 10 years. But just because you're mad or just because you think you're being disrespected doesn't mean you can go out and beat a team that's better than you. And I think Florida State, when you look at the skill positions, Florida State has a clear advantage in that game. They still have Will Shipley. He's still a talented back. I don't think their offensive line is bad. I just think they got some things that they really got to figure out. They cannot push the ball down the field. They don't have receivers that have shown capable to win one-on-ones, and they kind of dink and dunk you, which turns into the situation, like I said, with LSU. They run a short dink and dunk offense. If you get ahead, I'm honestly surprised in the LSU game when Florida State went up 31-17 or 38-17 even, that they didn't bring in Nussmeier and try and just air it out to try and get back in that game, because they run that really dink and dunk style offense. Are they going to be able to catch up with a big play offense? And it was funny, a Clemson fan who told me I didn't know what I was talking about said that explosive plays don't matter as long as you can move the ball down the field. And I was just like, okay, man, well, when you're down by 20 points and you're trying to throw the ball 5 yards down the field, good luck catching up. And so if they can't generate some explosive plays, you can pull up tight coverage on them. And I feel like you can have success against Clemson this year, which leads me to kind of change my projection for the season. Like at first I had picked us to lose that game because I thought Clemson would take a step back, but I thought that it wouldn't be quite to the what we saw on Monday night because, regardless of mistakes, they got blown out by 21 points by Doak. It is just unreal to see. Like, that was one of the almost as enjoyable as watching Florida State win and watching Florida lose was watching Clemson just get absolutely humiliated on national television. It's eye-opening. And so I do think Florida State can go up there if they bring their A game. Of course, Clemson, like we said, they're going to be improved after 2 tune-up games. If you bring your A game, I think Florida State can go up there and win. And so, like I said, outside of a hiccup game or something like that, I know I predicted 11-1, so this isn't a big shift, but, without some unforeseen circumstance like an injury or just a fluke game or something like that, I think Florida State's going to go 12-0 in the regular season. And I have no problem saying that with my chest out, you know what I mean? Like, I just think they're the best team on the schedule when they're firing on all cylinders. Does that mean they're going to go 12-0? Not really. It doesn't mean it because we saw them have bad games last year. But if they can play like they did in the second half, there's no reason they shouldn't beat everybody on the schedule. So looking down the schedule a little further, just to kind of go through why I think they're going to be able to do that. So you look at Boston College, and we're going to do Southern Miss last because we're going to work it a little bit longer to a game preview. But looking at BC, they lost to Northern Illinois this weekend. I thought BC was going to be one of my most improved teams this year. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case. Hafley is really coaching for his job at this point. Now, they did play their backup quarterback most of the game. I don't know if that was due to injury or just a guy getting benched. Garwo only had 43 yards on the ground. Rutgers put up 170 on the ground against Boston College. That game, I wasn't really worried about it to begin with, but I'm less worried about it now. Maybe if you look at, the ladder of expectations, maybe you pull them down a rung. We already talked about Clemson. I think that they're still one of the toughest teams. They're still the toughest team on the remainder of your schedule, but it doesn't look as daunting of a task as it did before. Looking at Virginia Tech, they got a win under their belt in game 1. They beat Old Dominion. It's Old Dominion. They're not a great team, but they did beat Virginia Tech last year. I think the biggest takeaway from that Virginia Tech game, they scored 36 points. And the one question we had with Virginia Tech this year was they had a middle-of-the-road defense last year, but they have a defensive-minded head coach, and it was year 1, but their offense was abysmal. It was terrible. I think they averaged something like 16 or 19 points a game. Could they find life on offense? And they didn't score over 30 points the entire season last year. So for them to hit 36 in game 1, that was a big achievement for them. And, they have a new receiver now that they actually got from Old Dominion, Ollie Jennings, who had a good game for them. So I think Virginia Tech is still not a team that you're really worried about, and you did see I don't know if you saw, but the recent announcement that the Virginia Tech game is sold out, so Doak's going to be rocking for that game. You should have, a nice crowd advantage there, but maybe they're a little bit tougher than you thought. I still think Florida State is a heavy favorite in that game. And then Syracuse, this is one of the teams that it's hard to judge week 1. They beat Colgate, who was a 3-8 FCS team, not toothpaste, but they beat them 65-0. You didn't really learn anything about that. They have a really weak schedule the first couple weeks. I think the only tough team not even tough, but the only Power 5 team they play is Purdue, so we'll kind of have to wait to that game to see how it is. But Purdue's probably going to take a big step back because they lost a lot, including their coach. Duke, we did talk about some of what Duke did in that Clemson game. This is a team that I'm going to eat a little crow on. I thought that they would take a little bit of a step back this year against a much harder schedule because they did good in year 1, but they beat a bunch of bad teams. They beat Clemson by 3 touchdowns, and that is really impressive. I think Duke is going to be a team that you cannot sleep on this year, but I think now that they beat Clemson, everybody's going to give Duke their best shot because no one's going to just sleepwalk past Duke anymore, which I don't think anyone was going to sleepwalk past Florida State, but now that you blew out LSU, you're going to get everybody's best shot. So Duke is still not perfect. They struggled to block Clemson like we talked about. They had a 47.7% pressure rate on their dropbacks. And like we said with Riley Leonard, he's a great running quarterback. We just need to see how the arm looks because he only had 175 pass yards, 0 touchdowns through the air, 50% completion rate in that game. Now, I will say one thing that I do like about the LSU game, tying it to the Duke game. I think you run a similar game plan here because you know that their biggest threat is Riley Leonard running the ball. So I think that you saw them do a very good job against Jaden Daniels in that game. They held him to only 18 scramble yards, and last year he had way more than that. You held him under 100 rushing yards. So I do think you can run a similar game plan. You've already been prepped for a mobile quarterback. You've already seen that type of offense, so that makes me feel better in that game. And I will say that, when you see what they did against Clemson, knowing that, they don't have the size receivers that Florida State has. They don't have the size up front or the talent level that they have. It's impressive what they're able to do. And I don't think you're going to be able to sleepwalk through that game, but I still think Florida State is going to be able to beat Duke. I don't think that's going to be a problem. I don't think it's going to be, necessarily 100-0. But at the same time, I think a lot of what Duke was able to do had a lot to do with Clemson playing like garbage. You know what I mean? A lot of the red zone mistakes, a lot of the red zone mishaps did cost them that game. But, when we say cost them the game, I wasn't looking for who won and lost. I was really in that game, I thought Clemson was going to win regardless. I just wanted to see how it looked. I said in the pregame show that, or the postgame show, we had talked about that game and who I thought would win. I said, if you were to see Clemson come out and beat Duke 45-3, I think you're worried about Clemson and you realize Duke is probably not who you thought they were going to be. If they were to win that game 28-20, maybe you feel a little bit better about Clemson, a little worse about Duke. But now that you see this, I think it was really eye-opening to see what they did. Continuing down the schedule, looking at Wake Forest, they beat up on an FCS team, again, just like a lot of the other teams here. But they only won by 20 against Elon, 37-17. Not really a super dominant performance. They still have a good passing attack. New quarterback Mitch Griffith came in and had 329 yards and 3 touchdowns. But I did watch a little bit of this game, and some of those were just really too easy against an overmatched defense. The one thing that stood out to me about that Wake game, they did allow 4 sacks and had a lower success rate and less scrimmage yards than Florida State had against LSU. So if you think, now Elon is a team that generates a lot of sacks. I heard them talking about that on the broadcast. But if they gave up 4 sacks to Elon and you sacked LSU 4 times, and we said that Wake Forest is probably going to have a little bit of a rebuilding year on the offensive line because they lost some important pieces, and Mitch Griffith doesn't have the running ability that Sam Hartman has. I think Florida State's defensive line can eat in this game. And that could be the factor of blowing up that slow mesh offense and having success. Now, they do have some talented receivers, and so we'll have to see. They play Vanderbilt coming up this weekend. I know Vandy's not really a great team, but it'll be a much better test for Wake Forest, so we'll wait and see how that goes. Pitt beat up, again, another 3-8 FCS team. They dominated that game. I think it was 45-7. They won it exactly how you would expect them to. 491 yards to 126. Again, you dominated a bad team. But they do play Cincinnati this weekend, so we'll see how that goes. That'll be a better test for them. Miami, it was fun to talk about this game, the Battle of the Miamis, the Confusion Bowl as they used to call it. But you really didn't expect Miami to lose this game. Although, I guess it is really, truthfully, a step forward for Miami because they didn't lose like they did last year against a cupcake in Middle Tennessee. But really, my takeaway for this game is you got to see what they're going to do against Texas A&M coming up. That's really the most important way to judge them is with Texas A&M next week. But I think their defense did look better, obviously, against it was an overmatched opponent. Their offense was still not the most impressive. They went into halftime at 16-3. So, they're going to have a big step up in competition this weekend. So we'll see how they do against Texas A&M. Now, one quick shot at Miami, because why not? I did see something that came out. I think it might have even been in I don't know if it was photoshopped in there, but it was in a Publix ad that they're running a special where if you buy a Texas A&M ticket, that you get a Georgia Tech ticket for free. So they have a BOGO deal on tickets. The tickets to this game were like $3. The Miami of Ohio, their crowd did not show up. The stadium was half empty once again. And I do think that it does speak to the trajectory and the difference between these two programs and where they're at right now. Florida State has sold out the student section for Southern Miss. You've sold out Virginia Tech. I imagine the Miami game is going to be a sellout later in the season. And so I just think it was kind of funny to see and kind of point to that. But they'll get a big test, and we'll see how it goes against Texas A&M. Maybe they'll have some fans show up for that as well. Florida, the last one we're going to talk about, besides Southern Miss, we know they lost to Utah with 8 starters out, and they just don't look good. And we didn't expect them to look good. We thought Florida was going to have a tough season this year. Mertz is kind of who we thought he was going to be. He wasn't necessarily like everybody from Florida said, well, they misused him at Wisconsin, which was the case, and he can certainly get better. But, they thought he was going to be a lot better than what he was. I don't think he was bad. I just don't think he was he's just not a special quarterback. And when you lose that rushing ability, that dual threat that Anthony Richardson had, and you don't replace it with a much better passing threat, that's not really a good combination. And that's why you saw 13 pressures, 5 sacks, 38.5% pressure to sack ratio on Mertz. That's one of the highest I've ever seen. They only rushed for 60 yards, 4.3 yards per carry. Montrell Johnson and Travis Etienne only combined for 31 yards to combined, averaged under 4 yards per carry. And, when we did our preseason preview, I talked about how Miami, I had to give them credit, even though I didn't like it. I thought they did good in the portal on their offensive line. I said I thought Florida, what they lost was better than what they brought in, and it appears that's the case. When you look at their defense, they have size. They're massive. That defensive line is huge. But even it was something that the broadcasters talked about during the game is, I think it was Kirk Herbstreit that said, like, they have size, but they're slow. It's not a very athletic defense. And I think one stat that really shows is, especially with the defensive line, is they had pressure on 45% of Utah's dropbacks, but only had 1 sack. So they really couldn't get to the quarterback when they got in the backfield. And another thing that we had mentioned with Florida, with Austin Armstrong, their new defensive coordinator, they run a very aggressive style of defense at Southern Miss, but they give up the big play a lot. And then, boom, lo and behold, very first play of the game, they air it up and just pop the top off the defense, and Utah gets a touchdown through the air. So, I don't expect Florida to be any better than what I thought. I think they're still in for a really rough year. We'll see what they can figure out between now and the last game of the season. So looking at your next opponent, next on the schedule, this Saturday night, 8:30 p.m. inside Doak Campbell Stadium. I can't wait to be back in Doak. We know the student section is sold out. They're already offering overflow tickets into the other sections. I think it's going to be a great crowd coming off this LSU hype and this big win that they had. It's also really, if you think about it, it's the last home game until October. I think you're going to have a great environment for this one. I don't expect Florida State to just sleepwalk through this game. Now, this isn't a 3-win FCS team. It is a Sun Belt team. They have some guys. They have Frank Gore Jr., so you really can't sleepwalk through this game. But I think Florida State should win this one by at least, probably 30 points. Depends on how garbage time goes. But looking at Southern Miss, Week 1, they played Alcorn State, a 5-6 FCS team from last year. They beat them 40-14. It's about what you would expect. 441 yards to 226. It was a strange split, though. Alcorn only had 44 passing yards. They only threw the ball 14 times. Even weirder, they only ran 43 plays in this game. That was like an abnormally low number of plays. Southern Miss ran 66, and Florida State ran 76 against LSU. So not only is the level of talent going to take a dramatic increase, but the pace of play is going to take a dramatic increase as well. So looking at the split, they had 44 passing yards, but they gave up 182 rushing yards to Alcorn State. And to me, we know Florida State ran the ball for over 200 yards 8 times last year. I think this is going to be a game where you can hit 2 bills on the ground. You can get Trey Benson going. You can get Keziah Holmes in the game. You can get Rodney Hill going. You can get some of your other backs going. You might even see C.J. Campbell in this game. This is one from looking for Florida State to hit 200 on the ground, at least have a big rushing down the ground. And you didn't do terrible against LSU. You had 135 yards, but I think this is one where you're going to be able to get the ground game going. Now, of course, they only had 44 passing yards, and Florida State's going to throw it a lot more than 14 times. So I think their secondary is going to be in for a shock when they go up against these receivers after really not having to defend anything last week. Southern Miss wasn't perfect. They were 5 of 14 on third down, 42% success rate. The Clemson transfer, Billy Wiles, did win the starting job. They also did play Holloman Edwards, who came in from Houston. Now, he had a good day. I'll give it to him, even though considering the competition. 267 yards, 3 touchdowns, 72.4% completion rate, 9 pressures, 1 sack. I know a lot of people talk about they gave up 3 sacks, but 2 of those were against the backup, so the starter only got sacked 1 time. They did have a receiver go for over 100 yards in that game, caught 5 of his 6 passes, so he may be the one to watch there. Jacarius Caston, he was targeted the most. Now, strangely, Frank Gore Jr. had a really quiet day. He only had 36 yards. I think he played 31 snaps, so he didn't play a ton, but he played half of the offensive snaps there. And only had 36 total yards, but what really stood out to me in this game, and we know he's good. Maybe they were just saving him for this game or whatever. But if they're severely overmatched, you may not see them risk their best player in this game either, more than about the first half. But what really stood out to me was Southern Miss only generated 1 pressure and 0 sacks. Now, we know they didn't have a lot of opportunity because Alcorn State only had 14 dropbacks. But in 14 dropbacks, you had 1 pressure and 0 sacks. And to me, we feel pretty good about what this defensive line is going to be able to do. I mean, the offensive line at Florida State, we feel good about Jordan's ability to avoid pressure. I just think Jordan's going to have all day to be able to throw the ball back there to a dominant receiver core. And I will say the thing about this game, like I said, this is not one that you can necessarily sleep through, but I do think Florida State, in this game, you want to see them come out and have a clean game, clean up some of the mistakes and the penalties that they had in the last game, and then, just kind of rack up some stats for the starters, see some things you like, and then get them off the field and get some of the backups in and rest those guys for down the road. I still think Florida State's going to win this game like we said, depending on how garbage time goes, I think they're still going to win the game like 51-10-ish or something like that. And like I said, man, I just really think that this LSU game showed so much. It meant so much to this season and the way it started things off. Because like we said earlier, you really couldn't afford to lose both Clemson and Florida State and Clemson and LSU and still be in the driver's seat of the playoffs. You really wanted to at least split at a minimum. But now you have the opportunity to potentially win both. And I think it's crucial because now you really can't afford to lose to Clemson because they're not a top 10 team that you could kind of get looked past. I think it's really important that you beat LSU because you don't have that big-time redemption game against Clemson, which they could turn out to not lose another game this season. We don't really know that. But I do think it was really a statement coming out by Florida State. And like I said, just the killer instinct that Mike Norvell has. I think he's going to try and run it up on a lot of teams this year, and I can't wait to see it. We can't react too much off of one game, but we saw a glimpse Sunday night of what this Florida State team can be, and in my opinion, they can be one of the best teams in the country when you consider they absolutely dominated the reigning SEC West champion. That brought back a lot of pieces, and that's going to be a good team. It's not like they're going to go out and go 7-6. I highly doubt. I would be surprised if that were the case. So just what a fun weekend to open football. You saw Florida lose. You saw Clemson get embarrassed on national TV. You had the talk of the weekend as far as games go. You had the biggest win of the season under your belt so far. And, it's like we talked about in the postgame show. I know a lot of it's based on last year's stuff and what your roster looks like. There's more than just what happened on the field that goes into rankings. But if you just took a blind resume, Florida State's number 1 right now, without question, because they have the biggest win of the season. So now it'll be interesting to see how they back that up. Do they go into Southern Miss and do they dominate them like you're supposed to? Because that's something we saw from them last season is they didn't really beat the tougher teams on the schedule outside of LSU, but they blew out the bad competition. And so now you just beat the best or the second best team on your schedule. Now let's see how you handle these. Do you pull a Clemson and go into the games against lesser opponents and just roll the helmet out there, or do you show up ready to dominate? And I think that's going to be the case. I think they're going to be able to take care of business here. Then I think you got Boston College on the road next week, who's kind of reeling right now. I think you'll be able to take care of business there. Use this time to work some things out, and then let's really focus on that Clemson game. But it's one game at a time, and it's only been one game, so we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But I just, this is what we wanted to see, and we got to see a glimpse of it. And now they have a couple of games. That's why I like the schedule to set up the way it is. Like we talked about before, you have that big test early, and you passed it. Now you have a couple games to kind of work on things. Then you had that big matchup against Clemson that's early in the season with a new quarterback, a new offense. Then you have a bye week to reevaluate after that, to rest up and get healthy for the stretch down the way. But man, what a statement to open the season, and what a great time to be a Seminole fan. This just the energy around this program, the vibe around this program, and the way it's headed, and the way we feel about it. We deserve this after the last couple of years. I ain't gonna lie, like we deserve this. Everybody's mad. I think the funniest thing about the LSU game was everybody said beforehand that they're top 5, they're SEC, they're gonna beat Florida State, and then as soon as Florida State wins, now all of a sudden they're overrated and they're not that good anyway. And it really is funny how the narrative changes every time Florida State wins a game. All of a sudden the team isn't any good. I just think that's a false narrative, and it's funny to watch play out. But, we're going to celebrate. We're going to be happy about this because we have been through the dark days, but we also know that there's a long way to go, and it's a long season, and no win is guaranteed. So I'm just excited to watch the season play out, knowing that you can go into any game on Saturday and compete or possibly win against all the teams on your schedule. And now you look at. I think we said earlier in the pregame or in the preseason stuff that you wanted to win the ACC and let the playoffs handle themselves. But now it is in the back of your mind. Now it is in the back of your mind that this is a potential thing that could happen as long as you can stay healthy. Because I still think that is critical that Florida State stays healthy. You need your top guys available. But man, what a fun weekend to open the season, and I can't wait to be back in Doak this Saturday. I'm so excited to just be back home, with an excellent crowd at night, great atmosphere, and to watch this team work. And I'm really excited about it. We'll be tailgating in the intramural fields right in front of the stadium. If you guys happen to be walking through there, come find us, say Go Noles, and chat it up for a minute. You'll be able to find us. I'll be at Alumni Hall on Friday stocking up on some gear. If you happen to see me there, say hey as well. Go by there, use that code, get you some gear as well. Code SPEAR, 20% off only until Saturday, so you want to make sure you take advantage of it. But just because I'm going to be in Tallahassee, I wanted to kind of jam everything in one episode here. I didn't feel like Southern Miss was quite enough to break off into its own episode. So we ran a little bit over an hour, but I hope you guys enjoyed this one and had some fun on this episode. But I'm going to try and do a post-game wrap after the game outside of Doak or something like that. So be on the lookout for that. Obviously, we probably won't be able to do a live stream this week just because I don't know what the internet connection and all that's going to be down there. But maybe when we get back, that's something that we can jump on and do. I have some exciting things. I'm waiting for some news to announce. I got some giveaways planned coming up, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Like I said, I got some other things I want to share with you, but I want to confirm some details first. But yeah, guys, just stay tuned because we got a lot of exciting things coming up. It's going to be a really fun season, and it started off in the best way possible with an absolute domination of LSU, 45-24 Florida State. We will catch you guys on the other side. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support, and go Noles.